Hi everyone, hope you all are fine. Today we are going to begin a new lesson in part B of Indian economic development. In the second lesson we learned about the Indian economic planning from year 1950 to 1991. There we saw what all changes were made in the agricultural sector, industrial sector, and then we had a quick review of all the measures taken in the agricultural and industrial sector and appraisal of agricultural and industrial sector. There we could see so many changes in the agricultural sector, such as the stagnancy was removed, then so many new methods and measures were introduced in the agricultural sector. Zamindari system was removed, then land reform measures were introduced by the government. So with that India could achieve the goal of self-reliance, but and the GDP also, there was a contribution, there was an increase in the agricultural sector, its contribution to GDP. All these points we discussed under the appraisal, both positive as well as negative effects also we discussed. And one of the major the drawback that we found was more number of people were engaged in the agricultural sector than what is required, problem of disguised unemployment. Likewise, in the industrial sector also, so many changes were made by the government, including the industrial policy resolution. Recall all those points we learned in industrial policy resolution, like industrial licensing, and with that so many changes happened in the industrial sector also. And towards the end we learned what was the role of public sector in the industrial sector development. Government was undertaking so many industrial sectors and it played a very important role in running the industrial sector in the economy. And being the mixed economy, actually the responsibility should go for both private sector as well as public sector. And we learned that some scholars pointed in favor of running the public sector as the dominant one, because in so many areas large number of industries came up in our country, such as more number of consumer industries, now more number of capital good industries. All these were increasing in our country during that time period. And some scholars pointed out that the government could give some of the areas to the private sectors also, like hotels, then telecommunication, etc., where private sectors could run that properly. And we also learned that in industrial sector, due to the large number of public undertakings or government undertakings, government was running few sectors, in few sectors government was running in loss. And as it was a government sector undertaking, it was not able to shut down also. So government was functioning in loss. So these were the major defects that we found in the industrial sector, both negative effect as well as the positive effect. Now, even though government introduced so many measures in the agricultural sector as well as in the industrial sector, some drawbacks were there even during the planning period. Due to the drawbacks of the planning period, government had to face so many financial crises. The planning was not up to the mark. In certain areas, government had to find difficulties, just as I explained about the industrial sector, where public sector was playing a dominant role instead of bringing private sector also into its part. So some of the areas government was finding very difficult to move on, and government had to face a financial crisis. So by the end of 1991, it was a very difficult time period for Indian government to survive in the economy. Therefore, at that time, the government thought of bringing out some economic reforms, reform measures in the economy. Reform measures in the economy, a change was inevitable during that time due to the practical difficulties in the planning. Therefore, government evolved economic reforms in the year 1991. So that is a new chapter which you are going to learn, that is economic reforms, which was made in the year 1991. So last chapter was a period from 1950 to 1991, and this lesson is the measure, economic reform measures government is going to government introduced in the year 1991. Now, economic reforms, you know, reform measures made in the economy by the government. Now, let us see what all were the reasons for the economic reforms. Reasons for economic reforms. The first reason is poor performance of public sector. Just as I told you now, in certain areas, the performance of the public sector was not up to the mark. Certain government undertakings were running at a loss, and actually it wanted to shut down, but being a government sector undertaking, it was very difficult for the government to think of shutting down of those industries. Therefore, even though if it was a loss, the government was forced to run that public sector undertaking. So, because of that, government had to face huge loss. So, poor performance of public sector, huge loss was incurred by a number of public enterprises. Even though it was under the huge loss, it was running because there was no other way of shutting down a government enterprise. Point number 2, what is the next reason for an economic reform? Why government was going for an economic reform? Second reason is deficit in the balance of payment. Now, you very well know what is a balance of payment and what is meant by a deficit in the balance of payment and surplus of balance of payment. We have learned in macroeconomics in chapter 5, which you have already went through it. Okay, now deficit to because of the deficit in the balance of payment. What is meant by a deficit in the balance of payment? When receipt is less than the payment, when export is less than import. Now, even after fixing a heavy tax and quota restrictions and slow growth of exports due to low quality products and higher price, these are the reasons which comes under the balance of payment. Let us see one by one. Even after fixing heavy tax and quota, what is meant by that? Heavy tax and quota. Now, quota restrictions were made by the government. What was that quota restriction? Quota restriction on the import. The imports from other countries were not encouraged because government feared the foreign interference. So, even after fixing that kind of restrictions, there were some necessary goods that we wanted. So, those goods were flowing into our country at a larger amount where we were not able to produce. So, in that case, the money was flowing outside from our country for those imports. So, as the money was flowing outside, the payment became more than the receipt. That is important point to be noted. Even after fixing the heavy tax and quota, heavy tax were also imposed on the imports which are coming this side. So, even with these two measures, government couldn't control the imports because necessary items which we were not able to produce ourselves, we were forced to buy it from outside. Therefore, in such cases, payment was greater than the receipt. Therefore, it caused for a deficit in the balance of payment. Then, slow growth of export. Another reason for the deficit in the balance of payment was slow growth of export. I told you, India was following a policy of inward looking strategy in such a way that India was not encouraging import. Only for necessary items India was encouraging import. What was the main reason for that? Because India feared that there will be problem of foreign interference because it had an experience of British rule for more years in the economy, isn't it? Therefore, government prevented the flow of imports through quota and tax. As the import was prevented by the government, India was not free to do exports with other countries because balance of payment is a statement which shows the export and import of the country. So, as the import was not encouraged by the government, we also couldn't increase the amount of exports to other countries. Other countries were not showing that kind of interest to buy the goods from India. So, India didn't get that opening for export in the market. So, as a result, what happened? There was no receipt for India. So, receipt was less than the payment. This caused for again deficit in the balance of payment. So I hope these 2 points are clear to you. That is, even after fixing heavy tax and quota restrictions, heavy tax were imposed on imports and quota restrictions were also done on imports, even though the import was flowing to India for necessary items that we couldn't control. We were not able to produce that. We didn't have technology to produce that. So those imports were flowing to our country. Therefore, our money went outside. So deficit in the balance of payment. Then the next one is slow growth of export. In order to overcome that import, we couldn't encourage our export also, because other countries were not having a free movement of goods and services with India. So as a result of slow growth rate of export, we again faced a deficit in the balance of payment. Again, low quality products and higher price. Now that also paved a way for deficit in the balance of payment. How a low quality product and a higher price can pave a way for deficit in the balance of payment? Now, Indian government encouraged all the domestic producers to produce their goods in our own country. No imports are coming from outside. Only for necessary products, imports are being encouraged. So what happens? The domestic producers, they were so relaxed and they could produce the goods which were not of high quality. They always concentrated on production at a lesser cost, which can move faster in the economy. That means the quality of the products in India became deteriorated. So with the low quality products, what happened? India was not able to face a competition with outside countries. So Indian products were not good to compete with the foreign products. So there was no export encouraged in India. Other countries are also not interested because our good is not of a good quality. If the imports are encouraged, we will have a competition with the goods coming from outside. So such a competition was not encouraged in India because of import restrictions. Therefore, our producers concentrated on low quality products. So there was no export for India. Therefore, what happened? There was a deficit in the balance of payment. You know, we can achieve a surplus in the balance of payment only if export is greater than import. And next one is higher price. Whatever was produced in our country doesn't have to face any competition from outside countries. Therefore, our domestic producers were very confident. So what they did is that only the domestic products are available in the market. So whatever is produced by the domestic producers, its price went high. Due to the higher prices, they were so comfortable in selling their products, and they did not encourage, even government did not encourage the imports from outside countries. And as there was no imports, no export was also taking place. This also paved a way for deficit in the balance of payment. And if India is selling the product at a higher price, nobody will be interested to buy the goods from outside. So there was no receipt for us, only payment for imports. So this caused for a deficit in the balance of payment. So I hope all the points under deficit in the balance of payment is clear to you. I will point it out once again. Heavy tax and quota restrictions, slow growth of exports due to low quality products and higher price. Our exports were very low because of low quality, then quota restrictions, then higher price, etc. All these paved a way for deficit in the balance of payment. Now, you know what is the seriousness in deficit of balance of payment. Receipts will be more and payment will be very less. You can just imagine what will be the situation of an economy if there is deficit in the balance of payment, and if it persists for a particular period of time. It is a very serious matter. Now, next one is inflationary pressure in the economy. Another reason for economic reform, why government thought of a reform measure in the economy? Due to inflationary pressure in the economy. What is the main reason for inflationary pressure? You all know what is the main reason for inflation. Rise in the price. That is already there. You can connect it to the second point which I have explained to you. Only domestic goods were encouraged in India. All those domestic goods, its price was set very high by the domestic producers. Therefore, not only other countries were buying, even in our country also people were not able to buy the products at a very high price. That means when the price increased, what happened in the economy? Inflation happened in the economy. That was another dangerous situation that India was facing during that time period. Therefore, Indian government considered it as a very necessary element, considered it as very necessary for framing the reform measures. Now, next one is fall in the foreign exchange reserves. You know that every country will have some foreign exchange reserves with it. If the foreign exchange reserves are less, what will happen? Now you know that we are importing goods from other countries. Only necessary products were encouraged to be imported by the government. Now if we are importing those goods, we have to make payment for them, right? In what way we have to make the payment? In their form of currency we have to make the payment. So for that we need what? Foreign exchange reserves. During that time period, foreign exchange reserves within India was very less. It was very less. It came to be to the lower level. So what was the consequence of that? The consequence, it was not adequate. The consequence of that, it was not adequate to finance the imports for more than 2 weeks. That means foreign exchange reserves was very less. India didn't have the foreign exchange reserves to make the payment for the imports, not even for more than 2 weeks. The pathetic condition is being represented here. Even for more than 2 weeks, there was no money, foreign exchange reserves within India to make payment for imports. Then to pay interest for international debtors. I told you, now the situation of India during that time period was very critical. Therefore, sometimes government had to face more expenditure than revenue. I told you, for imports, for necessary items, India had to make payments. So in such a situation, expenditure was more than revenue in so many cases. Therefore, government, to face that expenditure, it started borrowing from so many international institutions. When we borrow money, it has to be repaid with the rate of interest. And if we are borrowing from other international institutions, we have to repay the amount with the rate of interest in the form of their currency, right? Therefore, only if we have foreign exchange reserve, we can repay the amount. India was not having the foreign exchange reserves even to repay the interest on international debtors. Okay, so that was another major reason. So the fourth reason is fall in the foreign exchange reserves. There was no sufficient reserves with India to make payment even for the imports and for international debtors. Then comes the next one, inefficient management. I told you in some cases expenditure was more than revenue for government. Now, what is the main source of revenue for the government? There are two major sources of revenue for the government. One is tax and the other one is running of public enterprises. Government gets revenue in two ways. One is by collecting the tax from the people and the other one is by running the public sector enterprises. These two areas government failed. You know very well about public sector enterprises. Most of the public sector enterprises were running at a loss during the planning period and government had to shut down. But as there was no possibility, as government cannot shut down as it is a government sector, it continued to function even though there was a loss. Then the next one is tax. Tax collection was also not done properly during the planning period. Many people could escape without paying the tax. Government didn't have a track of collecting the tax. All these were major defects associated with the planning period. Therefore, efficient management, through inefficient management, government was not able to generate sufficient revenue from tax and public enterprises. Therefore, in order to meet the expenditure, government had to borrow money from international institutions, and money which was borrowed from the international institutions was later on used just to meet the consumption needs. To meet the daily needs, government had to borrow from international institutions. So, that much pathetic the situation was. So, government couldn't collect the amount of money from the tax, as well as there was no profit in running the government enterprises. Therefore, source of revenue is very less for the government. Therefore, anyway government had to exist to for the welfare of the people. So, anyway government has to find out some source. So, as now the situation is not favorable for the government, what government did? Government began to borrow the money from international institutions. So, those money which was borrowed from the international institutions were used by the government in order to meet their daily needs. That much pathetic the situation was. So, you can just imagine what was the position of the government during that time period. So, when money is borrowed from international institutions, just think of the other side also. What is it? Interest has to be paid in the form of foreign exchange. That was again a burden for the government. So, that is what is given here. Inefficient management. Government was not able to generate sufficient revenue from the tax and public enterprises, and borrowed money from international institutions and were just used to meet the consumption needs. Now, huge burden of debt. Government had to face a huge burden of debt, because as expenditure was more than revenue, government had to borrow. Borrowed money had to be repaid with the rate of interest. So, it was a huge burden for the government. So, because of this, India had to survive. So, Indian government approached IMF and the World Bank, International Bank for Development and Reconstruction and Development, which is known as World Bank. So, India approached the IMF and the World Bank for some fund for its functioning, and IMF and the World Bank granted $7 billion as loan. It is not a small amount, $7 billion as a loan. But World Bank and the IMF gave the loan on the basis of certain conditions. Let us see what are the conditions. India should remove all kinds of restrictions on private sector. What do you mean by that? Private sector should be encouraged to invest more and more in the economy, and the government should support it. That means number of private sector undertakings should increase in the economy. Only on the basis they were ready to give the amount. The second condition that they put forward was reducing the role of government in certain areas. Government need not put head into all the areas. Certain areas should be restricted for the government. Let other areas be concentrated by the private sectors. Therefore, there will be a jump in the investment in the economy. Then, what was the next condition? Removing all kinds of trade restrictions. Take away all the trade restrictions that was done by India during the planning period, such as quota restrictions, then all those kinds of the new measures taken by the government. So, remove all those things. So, on the basis of three conditions, the IMF and the World Bank granted $7 billion to India for its functioning. Now, with that, India signed, with IMF and the World Bank, India signed the new reform measure known as New Economic Policy. The name of that reform measure that India signed was New Economic Policy with the IMF and the World Bank. Now, New Economic Policy was signed in the year 1991, which is also known as NEP. And New Economic Policy has two measures. One is stabilization measure and the other one is structural reforms. Now, what is meant by stabilization measure? Stabilization measures are short-term measures and structural reform measures are long-term measures. Now, what all comes under the stabilization measures? Stabilization measures includes correcting weakness in balance of payment. That means correcting deficit in the balance of payment. And the next one, controlling inflation. You know what is that? Reduce the prices of the products in the market. To reduce the prices of the product in the market, what has to be encouraged? Importing of foreign goods in all the areas has to be encouraged. In fact, it means what? Removing all kinds of trade restrictions. Encourage goods from other countries to India. Okay. Then only there will be export from India to other countries. Thereby, BOP weakness also can be removed. That comes under the stabilization measures. All these are short-term measures. Structural reforms consist of long-term measures. By doing this, this will be accomplished. What is that? This improves the efficiency of the economy. Definitely, if the weaknesses in the deficit, weakness of deficit of balance of payment, weakness in balance of payment means deficit in the balance of payment. If it is removed, obviously the economy will improve. There will be efficiency in the economy and there will be increase in the international competitions. Definitely, if the exports and imports are encouraged, there will be increase in the competitiveness in the market. So, if this is being implemented, actually this also will get solved. This will automatically happen, isn't it? So, the stabilization and structural measures were framed out in the new economic policy. In the stabilization measures, we have correcting the weakness in BOP and controlling the inflation. This will automatically lead to improving the efficiency of economy and increasing the international competitiveness. Okay. So, I hope the introductory part is very clear to you. Reasons for economic reforms are very clear to you. Thank you.